the scale and simplicity of civilizations. I think it was de Tocqueville who first made me realize that there might be some link between the size and longevity of a civilization and its complexity in its structure. I was very taken with his idea that when he came to America, he found it very easy to understand. It was a new civilization, very recent, but it was also huge, and it was also very easy to understand, he said. Basically, it was laid out on a grid pattern, and if you stood in the middle of America, you could look down these lines or alleyways and read off the whole of American society from a few elementary features. One was equality, a driving force in all directions. Another was freedom, liberty, a driving force in all directions. And a third was fraternity or associationalism, which was also terribly important. If you understood those three, the grammar of the civilization from those three principles, you could, within a few weeks, he said, and certainly months, write a good account of America. So he felt he could understand America from a relatively short visit and a lot of reading and talking to people. He said when you thought about England, which he knew in many ways much better, he'd been there more often, he was married to an English wife, he'd read a huge amount about England. He said, I couldn't begin to understand England in a lifetime. It would take several lifetimes to begin to understand it, because it is old and because its principles and social structure and grammar is very complex. It's more like a forest in which there are winding paths and you can't see far down one of them. And he said you have to travel the whole way along a particular path, for example, the common law or the language or whatever feature it is, and go to the end of it before you can understand it, and then you have only understood one part of it. So he despaired of ever understanding England, his close neighbour, whereas he could understand America. Now that idea, I've begun to realise, is something you can extend beyond those two cases. And it leads to a possible law, which is that the larger the area that has to be covered by a civilization, the simpler it has to be, because to make it uniform and universal, it needs to be accepted by people in very, very different circumstances, different geographies, different subregions, and so on. And so you need some very simple binding features. Whereas if you have a small island like England, then you can make it very complex, and it doesn't matter if there's a huge amount of variation and people don't understand the principles at the bottom of it. So to take two further examples, one is at the complex end, and that is Japan. Japan is just like England in many ways. It's an island. It's an old island with 1,000 years or more of recorded history. And it's very complex, very difficult to understand, partly because it's split in two, the social organisation, social structure, government organisation, law and so on, is very like England's. Its family system, its feudal, centralised feudalism and so on, makes it very like England, which is very complex. And on the other hand, you have an aesthetic and cultural system, art and beliefs and semi-religions, which are from China and very, very different from England. So these mix uneasily together and lead to a good deal of complexity. But it is innately very complex. And again, this might be related to the fact that it's a bounded small island. The population is much bigger than Britain, but all the same, they don't have to have some simple unifying principles that hold them together. They're held together by the political structure, a strong semi-feudal system. But apart from that, and the market, apart from that, they can be very diverse and very complex and very convoluted. On the other hand, when you go to China, and that is the extreme example I've been thinking about recently, China is vast. It's far greater in population density and in age and in diversity than even America. And yet, the more I think about it, the simpler it becomes. At first, I thought it was impossible to understand because you've got so much regional variation in language and customs and so on and so on. But when I came to examine various parts of China, I realized that it's very uniform, and it's based on half a dozen or a little more simple, unifying and universal principles. The most obvious is the language, Mandarin, the written language, which everyone in China is taught at school and was taught for ages at school. And so everyone has the basic, similar, very strange and very simple, very ancient pictographic or logographic script. Very simpler, the simplest of all languages on earth, and still held by this great civilization. A second is the political system. Again, very simple, hierarchical, bureaucratic, imperial, based on everything going up to the center and then down again. The simplest of all structures in many ways, and this is universal and holds China together. A third is that the social structure, the more I looked at it, the simpler it was. There's no class or caste or differentiation in that way, but rather people are related to each other by the most elementary form of social structure, which anthropologists know, which is described by Durkheim and others as the form that you find in hunter-gatherer societies, where people are linked one to one with each other. So it's a vast network of one-to-one relationships. You can see this in Confucian philosophy, which puts huge emphasis on the relation between father and son, older brother, younger brother, man, woman, emperor, subject. So it's a kind of social organization you find in the very simplest of societies, and yet it's the one that holds together the biggest civilization on earth. So if you take those, and then you take the religious system, which both is a mixture of things, but each of them very, very simplified. Buddhism in China is an extreme form, Chan Buddhism, of introverted, meditative Mahayana Buddhism. Very simple form of it. Confucianism, as I've said, is very simple. Taoism is an ancient nature religion like Shinto. And so its philosophies, its language, its legal system also is traditionally very simple, punitive, and not much development of law. And its family system is an ancient patriarchal, patrilineal family system until recently. So China is very simple and easy to understand in the end, once you get through all the clutter, as Tocqueville found America was. You have surface complexities, but the job of an analyst and thinker is to get beyond those surface complexities and see what the base, the grammar, the deep structure is. And I think that China and Japan confirm to a certain extent what might be a general law, that the larger and more diverse a civilization, the simpler its quintessence is. And that's something one could consider when looking at all sorts of other places and meditating, for example, about different parts of Europe or Africa or South America. So it's a useful law or prediction, which I think Tocqueville has isolated for us, and I find helpful in thinking.